The courtroom was filled with an almost suffocating silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes each breath feel like a struggle. Every seat was occupied, and all eyes were focused on the man in the center of it all. Sergeant Nathan Carter sat in his wheelchair, dressed in full military uniform, the medals on his chest gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights above. His hand was tightly gripping the leash of the dog beside him, Thor, a German shepherd whose calm yet watchful eyes scanned the room. To the untrained eye, Thor appeared like any other military working dog. But to Nathan, he was so much more than that. He was family. Nathan's jaw clenched when the judge spoke, reminding him that this could be his last opportunity to speak. The army had decided that Thor was to be reassigned, considered government property, necessary for another mission. After years of risking their lives side by side, the thought of losing Thor now felt like an unjust betrayal, a wound that would never heal. His hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his voice barely steady as he began, "Your Honor," his tone raw with emotion. "Thor isn't just a military asset. He saved my life in ways that no one here could possibly understand. In the field, he pulled me from danger, shielded me from gunfire, even warned me of traps before I could see them. And when I came home, when I couldn't even face myself in the mirror, Thor was there. He gave me a reason to keep going. Please, don't take him from me." The room was eerily still, heavy with unspoken sympathy. Some spectators dabbed at their eyes, while others exchanged glances filled with a mixture of pity and disbelief. The judge's expression remained neutral, though his gaze lingered on Nathan for a long moment. He leaned forward, preparing to deliver his ruling. But before the words could leave his mouth, something unexpected happened. Thor suddenly lunged forward, yanking the leash from Nathan's trembling hands. The dog moved towards the judge, barking sharply, each bark echoing through the courtroom, making the crowd gasp in unison. The bailiffs instinctively stepped forward, but despite the intensity of Thor's barking, the dog showed no signs of aggression. His barks were urgent, purposeful. He was trying to communicate something. "Thor!" Nathan called out, his voice breaking with panic. But deep down, he knew this wasn't a simple outburst. He had seen this behavior before, countless times on the battlefield. Thor wasn't just barking, he was alerting them. He had detected something. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder. "What's wrong with the dog?" someone whispered from the back. Nathan's heart raced as he wheeled himself forward, his voice shaking with desperation. "He's not just barking. He only does this when there's danger. He's trying to warn us." The judge froze, his gavel forgotten in his hand. His eyes, which had been focused on Nathan, now locked onto Thor. The room fell silent once more, save for Thor's barking, which reverberated through the courtroom like a heartbeat. Whatever Thor sensed, it wasn't just about Nathan anymore. The dog knew something the rest of them didn't, and for the first time that day, Nathan felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just a farewell. Something much bigger was about to unfold, and Thor was determined to make them all see it. Thor's barking rang out, relentless and sharp, slicing through the tension like a blade. His body was low, tense, ears pinned back, eyes fixed firmly on the judge's bench. Nathan's hands clenched tighter around the armrests of his wheelchair as he observed the dog's movements. This wasn't random barking. Thor had detected something. Nathan's heart raced as a rush of adrenaline flooded his system. He could feel the tension rising in his chest. This wasn't war. This was supposed to be a courtroom, a place of order. "Thor, heel!" Nathan called, his voice firm, though it trembled with fear. Thor briefly looked back at him, his gaze sharp, as if to reassure his handler that he was in control. Then, without hesitation, Thor returned his focus to the judge's bench, pacing in slow, deliberate steps. His barks turned into deep, guttural growls that sent a shiver through the room. The audience shifted uncomfortably, murmurs growing louder as the earlier sympathy for Nathan turned into palpable unease. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his tone laced with irritation, "control your dog, or I will have to—" "Your Honor!" Nathan interrupted, his voice louder now, steadier, though his chest tightened with anxiety. "Thor isn't misbehaving. He's trained to detect threats, bombs, explosives, danger. He wouldn't act like this unless he felt something was wrong." The room fell silent once again as Nathan's words hung in the air. His explanation shifted the atmosphere, replacing skepticism with a growing sense of dread. But before anyone could respond, Thor suddenly stopped barking. The sudden silence was jarring, almost deafening. The dog's body went rigid, his head snapping toward the far end of the courtroom. His ears perked sharply, and a low, menacing growl rumbled from his chest. The room's tension was so thick it felt like it could suffocate them all. All eyes turned to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the room, and the collective unease that settled over everyone was palpable. Whispers of panic began to circulate through the crowd. Nathan's breath quickened as he followed Thor's gaze. His pulse thundered in his ears. He had seen this behavior before, on the battlefield, moments before Thor had detected a buried explosive or signaled an enemy ambush. Whatever Thor sensed now was not good. Not good at all. "Thor," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "What is it, boy? What's wrong?" Thor didn't move. His body remained locked in place, and the growl deepened, vibrating through the air like a warning. Whatever danger Thor had detected, it wasn't just a threat to Nathan anymore. It was something that could put everyone in that room at risk. Thor's growl reverberated through the courtroom like distant thunder, freezing everyone in place. All eyes were fixed on the dog, his body tense, his gaze unwavering, locked onto the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the room. Even the judge, who had been ready to reprimand Nathan just moments ago, appeared unnerved. His gavel was forgotten in his hand as he exchanged uneasy glances with the bailiffs. The air felt electric, thick with tension and fear. Nathan's breath came faster now, his grip tightening on the armrests of his wheelchair as if bracing for an explosion. He had seen this behavior too many times on the battlefield, and Thor's instincts had often made the difference between life and death. His warning had always meant one thing: danger was near. Very near. "Stay calm, Nathan," he murmured to himself, but the words felt hollow, even to him. The bailiffs, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated by the judge's bench. Finally, one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a wary expression, stepped forward. His hand rested on the weapon at his hip, though his voice betrayed his own unease. "It's just a dog, right?" he muttered, though his steps were cautious, his movements deliberate. Nathan shook his head, his voice rising just enough to cut through the murmurs. "No, Thor doesn't react to noise or people like this. He's trained to sense danger, things we can't see. Trust me, if he's growling like that, there's a reason." His words hung in the air, thick with urgency. For a moment, no one moved. The judge, visibly unsettled, finally nodded at the bailiffs, motioning for them to investigate the door. Thor's growl grew louder, more intense, as the bailiffs approached the door. The larger man hesitated, his hand gripping the metal handle, his face pale. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he watched, every muscle coiled with anticipation. Thor remained rigid, his growls morphing into a series of sharp, clipped barks. The bailiff, still cautious, reached out and slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. At first, it seemed empty, but Thor's barking only intensified, his eyes locked onto something unseen. The larger bailiff took a step into the hallway, his hand still resting on his weapon, glancing back at the courtroom. His face had gone pale, his eyes wide with dread. Then he turned forward again, deeper into the unknown. A second later, the silence was shattered by a voice that was thick with tension and uncertainty. "There's something here," the larger bailiff called out. Nathan's pulse quickened as his body stiffened in his wheelchair, every muscle tight with dread. Whatever the bailiff had seen, it was enough to set off Thor's instincts into overdrive. And Nathan, better than anyone, knew that Thor was never wrong. The air in the courtroom grew heavier, as if the very tension in the room was sucking the oxygen out of it. Thor's barking was sharp and relentless, each sound reverberating off the wooden walls, slicing through the oppressive silence. His body was frozen, locked in a stance of pure alertness, muscles tight, head low, eyes laser-focused on the dark hallway beyond the open door. The larger bailiff, now visibly uneasy, took another hesitant step forward. His boots clicked softly against the tiled floor, and his hand hovered near his weapon, his body stiff with caution, expecting something to leap out from the shadows. "What's going on out there?" the judge demanded, his voice cracking slightly despite his best effort to maintain authority. His grip on the gavel tightened, his knuckles pale as his eyes flicked nervously between the doorway and Thor. The dog's growls deepened, a low, menacing rumble that vibrated through the room and sent a chill down the spine of everyone present. The larger bailiff glanced back toward the courtroom, his face drained of color and taut with uncertainty. "I don't see anything," he said, his words hesitating, measured. "But something doesn't feel right." His eyes shifted back to the hallway, brow furrowed, as if trying to shake off his own creeping doubts. "It's too quiet," he whispered. The words cut through the room like a gunshot, breaking the tense silence. Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his stomach twisting into knots. He'd heard those exact words before, too many times, on the battlefield. And they'd always preceded disaster. "Thor doesn't react to nothing," he called out, his voice rising above the rising murmurs of the crowd. "If he's acting like this, there's a reason. We need to evacuate the room now." His command rang with urgency, but the spectators remained frozen, paralyzed by fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward, drawing a flashlight from his belt and aiming the beam into the hallway. The bright light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the polished floor beneath it. "There's nothing," he muttered uneasily. "It's just an empty hallway." But even as he spoke, his hand trembled slightly, betraying his calm facade. Thor, however, was far from calm. The dog's growling intensified, his barking more frantic, his body straining forward with such force that Nathan had to brace himself to keep hold of the leash. Then, suddenly, a sharp metallic clang echoed down the hallway, unmistakable and jarring, like a signal from the dark. The smaller bailiff flinched, the flashlight beam jerking wildly in his hand as he instinctively took a step back. Thor lunged toward the sound, barking furiously, his claws scraping against the floor as he strained against his leash. Gasps of shock and panic erupted from the courtroom, and the tension in the room quickly shifted to full-blown fear. The larger bailiff instinctively drew his weapon, his voice tight with alarm. What the hell was that? Nathan's heart was pounding in his chest as he shouted above the growing chaos. "Get Thor back!" His voice was a mix of fear and certainty. "He's never wrong. Something's coming." But before anyone could respond, the metallic clang echoed again. Louder, much louder this time, as if whatever had caused it was now much closer. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible energy that sent a ripple of dread through the room. Whatever Thor had sensed, it was no longer a question of if, it was now a question of when. The metallic clang rang again, sharper this time, closer still, like an alarm calling them to attention from the depths of the hallway. The tension in the courtroom tightened further, the weight of the unknown pressing down on everyone. Thor barked ferociously, his body straining against the leash, as though his sheer will could force the doorway open and confront whatever was waiting on the other side. Nathan gripped the leash tighter, his knuckles white, his pulse racing in his ears. He could feel it now too, something was wrong. Something was coming. The larger bailiff stepped fully into the hallway, gun drawn, eyes scanning the dimly lit corridor. His partner followed closely behind, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam cut through the darkness, but the hallway appeared empty, silent still. Yet, Thor's barking never wavered. His growls had deepened, more insistent now. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to act, to shout for everyone to evacuate, but he could already see the fear paralyzing the room. No one was moving. "Do you see anything?" the judge called out, his voice cracking as he leaned forward, gripping the gavel so tightly his knuckles were white. His usual authority was replaced with an unmistakable edge of fear, his eyes darting from the hallway to Thor. The larger bailiff glanced back over his shoulder, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Nothing yet," he said, his voice low but tight, as if speaking too loudly might provoke whatever was out there. "But it doesn't feel right." He took another cautious step forward, the weight of his boots echoing down the hallway. The spectators in the courtroom whispered nervously, some clutching their bags, others inching toward the exits. The uneasy energy in the room spread like wildfire, and panic began to set in. Nathan wheeled himself forward slightly, eyes locked on Thor. The dog had gone silent, his ears rigid, his body motionless. His eyes remained fixed on the open doorway. "Thor's locked onto something," Nathan murmured, his voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's there." Then, just as the larger bailiff reached the halfway point in the hallway, a shadow moved. It was quick, barely perceptible, but it was enough to make the smaller bailiff stumble backward, his flashlight beam jerking wildly. "There!" he shouted, his voice thick with panic. The larger bailiff froze, his gun snapping up, aimed at the darkness. Thor erupted into barking again, lunging so forcefully against his leash that Nathan nearly lost his grip. "Back up!" Nathan shouted, his voice echoing throughout the courtroom. "Get out of there!" The judge slammed his gavel, trying to regain order, but the sound was swallowed by the growing chaos. People were rising from their seats now, murmurs turning to shouts, the panic spreading through the room like wildfire. Then, from the darkness of the hallway, came another sound, a heavy, deliberate footstep. It wasn't hurried. It wasn't rushed. It was calm, and it was getting closer. Thor's barking turned into a snarling growl, his teeth bared as his body pushed forward with unrelenting force. Nathan's chest tightened as a wave of dread flooded his body. Whatever was in that hallway wasn't in a hurry. It wasn't hiding. It was coming straight for them, and it wanted to be seen. The heavy footsteps echoed louder, cutting through the growing chaos like a blade. Thor's snarls filled the air as his body strained against the leash, forcing Nathan to anchor himself in his wheelchair to keep from being yanked forward. The tension was suffocating now. Every pair of eyes locked on the dark hallway, all focused on the source of the sound that no one wanted to face. "Everyone stay calm," the judge shouted, slamming his gavel again, but the command fell on deaf ears. People were rising from their seats, clutching their bags, their hands, anything they could find, as if holding on to something could protect them from whatever threat was lurking. The larger bailiff stood frozen in the hallway, his gun raised and aimed into the darkness. His partner remained behind him, the flashlight beam nervously dancing across the walls, catching every shadow, yet revealing nothing concrete. Nathan's voice broke through the mounting noise, sharp and urgent. "Get out of there," he shouted, his tone cutting through the panic. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." His words sliced through the air like a knife, but the larger bailiff didn't move. Instead, he squinted into the dim corridor, his jaw tight. And then the shadow moved again. This time it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, purposeful. The smaller bailiff gasped audibly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "There's someone there," he stammered, barely above a whisper. The light caught something, just for a fraction of a second, an unmistakable silhouette. Tall, looming. Then it vanished, retreating back into the darkness, but it was enough to send a wave of fear rippling through the courtroom. The larger bailiff tightened his grip on his weapon, his voice steady but low. "Show yourself," he barked, commanding. "Step out where I can see you." But the only response was silence. Thick, oppressive. Silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Thor's barking reached a fever pitch, his claws scraping against the floor, his body coiled like a spring. Ready to pounce, ready to protect. And then it happened. The figure stepped into the light. Slowly, calmly, almost unnervingly so. It was a man, his face obscured by a hood, his hands tucked into the pockets of a heavy coat. His movements deliberate, his posture oddly relaxed, despite the chaos he had caused. He stopped just at the edge of the flashlight's beam, his head tilting slightly, almost as if amused by the scene unfolding before him. Thor's growling turned feral. His claws scraped against the floor, his body straining against the leash. Nathan could feel it now. Every nerve in his body screamed that something was very wrong. "Who are you?" the larger bailiff demanded, his gun aimed directly at the man. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he took another slow step forward. And then, the game had truly begun. Smirk visible beneath the shadow of his hood, sending a chill down Nathan's spine. His presence, like a dark cloud, seemed to draw the very warmth from the room. Nathan's breath caught in his chest as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over him. There was something deeply wrong about the man, not just threatening, but fundamentally wrong. The stranger raised his hands slowly, a subtle but deliberate motion that caused both bailiffs to tense, their grips tightening on their weapons. "Relax," the man said, his voice low, calm, and unnervingly confident. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." The way he spoke, as though his words lingered in the air, only made the room feel colder. Nathan knew, deep in his gut, that this man was lying. And Thor knew it too. The dog's growls became a constant, low, guttural sound that vibrated through the tense courtroom. The bailiffs held their weapons firm, but their hands were trembling despite their years of training. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest as he stared at the stranger. The man's posture was too calm, too deliberate, as if he thrived on the unease he was creating. "Step forward slowly," the larger bailiff ordered, his voice tight with authority, though there was a hint of fear creeping into his tone. The man tilted his head slightly, his face still obscured by the hood. And then he took one step closer, his boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. Every movement was slow, calculated, as though he were savoring every second of the attention focused on him. Thor barked furiously, lunging forward against his leash, his claws scraping against the floor. Nathan struggled to hold him back, his palms slick with sweat as his grip tightened. "Thor, no," Nathan muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "He can sense it. He knows something's not right." His words were barely audible, but the judge glanced at him briefly, his expression a mixture of fear and confusion. The smaller bailiff stepped forward cautiously, his flashlight steady in one hand, the other hovering near his holster. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Identify yourself." "Now." The man finally lifted his head, his face partially visible beneath the shadow of his hood. His eyes were sharp, cold, and piercing, holding an intensity that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," the man repeated, his voice calm yet eerily hollow. He reached into his pocket slowly, causing both bailiffs to stiffen and raise their weapons even further. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and someone in the back whispered, "He's got something." The room was on the verge of eruption, the tension straining like a fragile thread ready to snap at any moment. Nathan's instincts screamed at him to act, but he was frozen, gripping Thor's leash as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. The stranger's hand emerged from his pocket, holding something small and metallic. The bailiffs shouted in unison, "Drop it." The man froze, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Relax," he said smoothly, holding the object up. The light glinted off it, revealing it to be a simple key. But Nathan's unease only deepened. There was no relief in the air, no sense of safety. Thor's barking didn't falter. His focus remained locked on the man, as though the key was nothing but a distraction. Nathan's grip on the leash tightened as he whispered to himself, "It's not what it looks like. He's hiding something. He has to be." The man's smile widened, as if he could hear Nathan's thoughts. The dread in the room became suffocating, thick and heavy, filling every corner of the courtroom. The atmosphere felt like it was on the verge of breaking. The room fell into a tense silence, all eyes locked on the man holding the key. His smirk was a sharp contrast to the growing panic spreading through the courtroom. Thor's barking was relentless, his growls deep and guttural, trying to sound an alarm no one could ignore. Nathan's hands trembled as he tightened his grip on the leash, his chest heaving with the weight of his instincts screaming louder than the chaos around him. Something was terribly wrong. This man wasn't just a threat. He was the beginning of something much larger, much darker. "Drop the key and back away," the larger bailiff barked again, his weapon still trained on the man. The smaller bailiff edged closer, flashlight steady, but his face was pale with unease. The man, seemingly unfazed by the guns pointed at him, tilted his head slightly, his gaze flickering toward Thor. "That dog," he said, his voice low and almost conversational. "He's special, isn't he? Always knows things before they happen. That's what makes him so valuable." The weight of his words sent a ripple of dread through the room. Nathan's stomach dropped. How did this man know about Thor? How did he know about his abilities, his instincts? The hair on the back of Nathan's neck stood on end as he forced himself to speak. "How do you know that?" he demanded, his voice sharp and trembling in equal measure. Thor barked even louder, lunging forward against the leash as if trying to protect Nathan from something only he could see. The man's smirk grew, his eyes glinting with something dark and sinister. He slowly raised the key, his movements deliberate, almost taunting. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice dripping with chilling certainty. And then, with a sharp metallic click, he turned the key in his hand. The sound was subtle, but its effect was immediate. Thor erupted into a frenzy, barking louder than ever before. And before anyone could react, the lights in the courtroom flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. In that brief moment of blackness, Nathan could hear the gasps, the shouts, and the scrape of chairs as people scrambled in panic. When the lights flickered back on, the stranger was no longer alone. Behind him, emerging from the hallway like shadows come to life, were two more figures. Their faces were obscured, but their movements were deliberate. Their presence radiated menace, and they were holding weapons, sharp, metallic shapes that caught the light just enough to make their purpose clear. Nathan's heart raced. He looked down at Thor, who was now growling so ferociously, it sounded almost primal. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just about a man with a key. This was something much bigger, and much darker, and it had just begun. The courtroom descended into pure chaos. Spectators rushed toward the exits, voices rising in confusion and fear, while chairs scraped loudly against the floor. The two figures behind the stranger moved further into the room, their presence alone sending a ripple of dread through everyone. Thor barked incessantly, his body low, every muscle coiled and ready to spring forward. Nathan's grip on the leash tightened as adrenaline surged through him. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the stranger wasn't bluffing. Thor was the reason they were here. "Everyone stay calm," the judge shouted, slamming his gavel again, but his voice was drowned out by the panic swelling in the room. The larger bailiff stepped forward, holding his ground, flashlight now focused on the stranger. "Stay where you are," he commanded. But the stranger didn't stop. Instead, he took another slow, deliberate step forward, his movements measured, as though every second was a victory in the fear he was instilling. The expression on the stranger's face remained eerily calm, his presence unwavering as the figures behind him mirrored his pace, advancing with an unsettling synchronicity. The tension in the room was suffocating, each breath drawn by the spectators feeling heavier than the last. The stranger's voice cut through the chaos with chilling smoothness, measured and controlled. "No one needs to get hurt. All I want is the dog." His words were calm, yet the undertone of authority sent shivers down Nathan's spine. Thor growled low, his sharp gaze locked onto the stranger with unrelenting focus. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he took a step closer to Thor, his hand firm on the leash. "You're not taking him," Nathan said, his voice strong, though edged with emotion. He wheeled himself even closer to Thor, who stood steadfast by his side. "He's not just a dog," Nathan continued, his voice unwavering. "He's my partner, my family. I don't care who you are or what you think you're entitled to, you're not taking him." The room fell silent at his words, the weight of them hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. The stranger's smirk faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation as he narrowed his eyes, studying Nathan. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be," the stranger replied, his tone cool but carrying a hint of frustration. He turned his gaze back to Thor, as if the dog's very presence was a problem he could not ignore. "He's special, you know that, but keeping him will only make things harder for you." Nathan's jaw tightened, and his grip on Thor's leash remained firm. "Thor stays with me," he said firmly. "He's not going anywhere." The murmurs in the room swelled again, some voices calling for calm while others whispered in fear, unsure of what was going to happen next. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to slice through with a knife. Thor barked sharply again, the sound snapping everyone back to the present moment. His focus on the stranger was absolute, as if the stakes were clearer to him than anyone else in the room. Nathan's chest tightened as he leaned forward, every muscle in him coiled, ready to act. He would do whatever it took to protect Thor, the one being who had never let him down. Whatever the stranger's intentions were, Nathan was certain of one thing: Thor wasn't going anywhere. This standoff was far from over. The courtroom was thick with tension, every person frozen in a state of unease as the stranger stood motionless, his eyes locked on Thor. The dog's low growls rumbled like distant thunder, his body coiled and ready to spring into action at any moment. Nathan gripped the leash with both hands, staring directly at the stranger, his own determination mirroring the unwavering loyalty of his partner at his side. The two figures behind the stranger remained still, their presence looming, but they made no further move to advance. It was a standoff, one that seemed to stretch on endlessly, an unspoken battle of wills. The judge, breaking the heavy silence, cleared his throat and spoke with all the authority he could muster. "You've disrupted a court of law. This ends now. BFFs, escort these men out of here." His voice trembled slightly, but it was enough to reignite the tension in the room. The BFFs, regaining their composure, stepped forward cautiously, weapons still trained on the strangers. Thor let out another sharp bark, his teeth bared as his eyes tracked every movement of the strangers. The stranger raised a hand slowly, signaling for his companions to stop. His expression shifted, no longer anger, but something closer to resignation. "This isn't over," he said calmly, his voice carrying an ominous weight. "You think this is just about the dog, but it's much bigger than that. You'll see soon enough." He took a step back and his smirk returned, but there was no warmth in it, only cold, calculating confidence. "For now I'll leave. But he belongs to us, Nathan. And we'll be back." Nathan's chest tightened. His grip on Thor's leash never loosened. "He belongs to no one but me," he said firmly, his voice steady and clear. "And whatever it is you're after, you'll have to go through both of us." His words struck like steel. For the first time, the stranger faltered, his eyes narrowing as if assessing Nathan one final time. Without another word, he turned, motioning for his companions to follow him. The tension in the room didn't ease until they had disappeared through the same doors they had entered from. The silence that followed was deafening. Spectators slowly returned to their seats, their whispers rippling through the crowd as they tried to process what had just happened. The judge exhaled deeply, setting his gavel down with a shaking hand. "This court is adjourned," he said wearily, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. But Nathan remained where he was, his eyes still fixed on the door, unwilling to let his guard down. Thor finally sat down beside him, his growls fading though his body remained tense, alert to any movement. Nathan reached down, his hand gently brushing over the dog's head. "You did good, buddy," he whispered, his voice heavy with both gratitude and exhaustion. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Nathan stayed behind, his thoughts racing. He didn't know who that man was or why they wanted Thor, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. But for now, as Thor leaned against his leg, Nathan allowed himself a moment of quiet relief. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Because no matter what happened, their bond was unbreakable, and that was something no one could take away.